Welcome back to part 7 of the squat project A2G, and this topic we're going to be talking about the feet, or the foot and the ankle, in relation to your squat performance. So I think one of the key factors that I've been trying to get across through all of the previous 6 parts to this squat project is how the body works as an integrated system. Every part of the body will interlink with another, the tissues, the subsystems, the bones, the joints, the ligaments, the muscles, the nerves, all talk to each other, and it works as a unit. What we want to understand now is, up to now we've been looking at the descending influences. Today is all about ascending biomechanical influences. Now, of course, both can impact on each other, but we have a very practiced, systemized way of addressing the body, and that's exactly how I've been teaching you, is from the pelvis through spine, the nerve mobilizations, if you remember, shoulders, we did knee stability last week, and now coming to the feet. There's a very precise reason why we do it in that order. We did 25 years of research on 4,500 subjects, and the research tells us a systematic approach to addressing our physical issues makes sense, rather than ad hoc following chasing discomfort or following injuries around the body or just guessing where to start. So 60% of dysfunction comes from the pelvis, that's why we start there. Feet experts will of course talk about starting at the feet, and in some cases that might be right. But in most cases, when we think about what we're going to be doing when it comes to the foot in terms of exercises or interventions, really what we want to do is make sure everything above that is loading the foot is in as good a shape as possible first. Because if you're going to put an intervention into the shoe or the foot, the insole or the orthotic, we want to minimize that as much as possible and get the body doing as much of its improved function as it can on its own first. Of course, if you have messy feet, I have messy feet, this can actually inhibit you improving your function up above. So there are some cases where we need to be measuring and understanding what's going on, and we may modify that a little bit. For most people, starting at the pelvis is a great place to start. Eradicate what's going on here, then when we get to the feet, we know whatever's left is probably down to foot function. Keep sending in your photos before and after of your caveman squat and how it's improving. They're looking great. If you want to send them directly to me, if you haven't already, it's rachel@biomechanics.education.com. It'd be great to see how these tests and exercises are helping you. Now, there's a lot of talk about where your feet should point, squat widths, etc. And really and truly, when we look at the research, I've got some statistics I can give you in a moment. Actually, we should let the feet land where they want to land. There is no evidence to suggest that by changing your foot angle, you will hit one group of muscles more than another. Not substantially, not enough. In terms of injury reduction, then the foot position absolutely can have an impact, because the ascending forces coming from the foot position can change what's going on up above. Just to give you some evidence from other authors, Klein wrote a book called The Knee in Sports. He states that toes should be kept directly beneath the knees or slightly inside. This allows for the normal relationship to be maintained between the femur and the tibia in a flexion movement. However, Ripto's book, Starting Strength, in the 3rd edition this was, he talked about the feet being turned out to a 30-degree angle. Now, the problem arises is when you lose the context. So you would need to go and look at those studies to understand the context in terms of foot position. So after looking at the literature, there are about the performance of the squat, several authors recommend these various different foot positions. However, when you look at all of the literature and the information out there, it really fails to demonstrate how foot placement, lower extremity turnout during the squat can affect the activity of the leg muscles, as per Ninos et al. So let's just let our feet land where they want to land. They are going to turn out more if you go to a wider stance. That would happen naturally, automatically. And some of you may find that one foot wants to turn out a little bit more than the other. Mine certainly does. My right foot turns out slightly more than my left. And if I correct that for a nice alignment, it doesn't feel great. So let your feet land where they feel like they want to, and then use that as your baseline. So the foot is probably one of the most complex areas of the body in terms of all the joints, and the planes of motion that can occur through it. However, if we break it down into the simplest motions that we should understand in terms of movement, you're probably familiar with pronation and supination. Pronation and supination are both triplanar motions. And what that means is they're basically made up of 3 motions. So I'm just going to talk through those first of all. So for pronation, the foot will dorsiflex, evert and abduct. So it's a combination of those 3 movements. When we pronate, the foot becomes loose and floppy, broad and wide, so that's the point when it's absorbing the shock. And then supination is the opposite. So that's your plantar flexion, inversion and adduction. And that is to create a rigid foot so that when you go into supination, your mid-talar joint here will lock up, and that gives you a rigid foot to toe off through the gait cycle. So we need a good function of both of these movements in our gait cycle for the right force production, low risk and good healthy movement. What can often happen is the timing goes out of play. So for example, if you're a pronator, which is myself, and you have maybe a loose subtalar joint, which is below the talus, and maybe also a loose mid-tarsal joint, what that means is that as the body transfers over the foot, potentially you are still in pronation at the point at which you should be going into that supination. Supination occurs when this big toe comes back from it extends as your body goes over the top, which pulls on the plantar fascia, tightens up the arch, kind of gives you a rigid arch, gives you that toe off. So of course, if your foot turns out, or if the leg sort of comes over the foot like this, what can happen is you can still be in pronation at the point at which you should be stiff and rigid and supinating. So you can imagine everything that's going on above can control some of this overpronation or late supination. So if you have good pelvic control, good pelvic stability, good function at the top, it can reduce some of this error. If we can at least understand whether we do both pronation and supination well enough or at the right point, then we can understand maybe whether we need a more fitted shoe, whether we can be barefoot, whether we can need a more cushioned shoe, depending on the result of foot testing. So when you squat, I don't know whether you've tried different types of shoes, they will make your squat feel quite differently, particularly if you go from no shoes to shoes, understanding how that affects the way you move. So what we want to understand here is, when we're squatting, how does the foot, its function, and shoes or no shoes influence my squat? This then enables us to make a choice on whether we need to do some foot exercises or whether we need a certain shoe type. Now I have to confess that actually to test your own foot is going to be a real challenge, because you need to be down that end of the body with the person standing and wiggling the foot around. So really and truly, to understand whether you're a pronator, a neutral or a supinator, which I'll explain more in a moment, you really need to go and see a foot specialist. So a biomechanics coach will be able to assess your feet and understand the whole body, and then a foot specialist will understand the foot. So somebody who's a pronator probably shouldn't be squatting with no shoes on if they have a heavy load on their back. If you're doing it without any weight, there is a lesser risk. So again, we've got to contextualize each squat to understand what's right and wrong. So of course I can squat down barefoot and I'm perfectly safe. I probably wouldn't do it a lot, I wouldn't do it excessively, but if I'm putting some kilos on my back and squatting down, I would definitely have some shoes on. They'd probably be quite rigid shoes, they would be supporting, and they would minimize that overpronation or that rolling in the foot to enable me to produce the right amount of force and reduce injury risk. Now the flip side of that is somebody who's tested as a supinator. So a supinator is the type of foot that's very, very rigid and stiff. So that means that when they're hitting the ground, they actually have less shock absorption, and it's almost like hitting concrete all the time. So they may need a more cushioned shoe in terms of the gait cycle, but what that might mean in terms of squatting is the stiffer foot limits dorsiflexion, it limits the amount of forward motion through the tibia. It can also limit other movements through the foot as we squat down that may be required depending on your foot widths. And so it might be that they would need some manual assistance from a specific manual therapist who understands how to do manual articulations around the foot. Without that information, there are still things we can do. There is a dorsiflexion test we can do to test our calf mobility or our ankle range of mobility, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And also some exercises which are non-intrusive, they're not low risk, they're not contraindicated, so we can look at those as well. But once you've seen your foot specialist, these are the types of exercises or extra tests that you could do to complement everything we've done up to now. So because there's not a huge amount that we can do to test the foot, I strongly recommend, as I said earlier, that you go and see a professional who can test your feet. Now, most of us have an impression of whether we have a stiff foot or a loose foot. You may have an idea, but really and truly you can have tests. There are a series of tests we do on a diploma. The Foot Biomechanics workshop, for example, the Knee and Foot Biomechanics workshop, we teach 6 tests for the foot. And the same person can come out as a supinator on one test and a pronator on another test. So we need to understand the foot full function overall, and that is what a foot specialist or a biomechanics coach will be able to do for you. So what I'm going to be showing you here is the dorsiflexion test for ankle mobility or stiffness in the ankle. What you can do is find a piece of paper. I'm going to be going against a wall. I'm going to talk you through it. And we have an issue here whereby if you've got a skirting board that sticks away by a certain amount, we've got to be mindful of that. So I'll show you the test first so you can understand why. So you can place your foot onto the paper, and then your idea is that you take your knee towards the wall, and you should be able to keep the heel down on the floor. If we do that successfully, we bring the foot back and we repeat. Now, one of the key things to note is that we don't want the knee to be deviating out of that midline. So as we travel the foot back, again into position, and I'm just about getting to my end range there. I'm going to try a little bit more, if I can still manage that. Ooh, that's a struggle. So I'm going to come back in, and I'm just about there. And then what we do is we go from the toe to the point where we've measured from the knee. So if you have this extra lip, you've got to take into account this extra centimetre or inch or whatever it is. So from your toe, so I'm measuring from here to the glass, the point at which the knee contacted the wall. Ideally, we want to be around 5 inches to 12.5 centimetres for a good range through the ankle. Now, the interesting thing is that everybody talks about tight calves. And what we're taught to do in the industry is, as professionals and as gym members, gym goers, is if something's tight, is that we stretch it. And that can be the case in some cases. However, we're starting to realise that that is not the only thing that creates limitations around joints. The other thing to note, as I said, make sure that knee is nicely in line with the centre of the foot so that you're not getting that overpronated, supinated type of foot position, which may create a cheat mechanism. Take your measure, and then if you are less than the 5 inches or 12.5 centimetres, we may need to consider what is limiting your dorsiflexion. So if you remember back in part 4, we talked about nerves, and in the nerves section, what we talked about is how that the nervous system can create tension or subclinical spasm in muscles that are trying to protect that nervous system if it's tethered down. A big contributor to tight calves is a tight sciatic nerve, and the tension can be coming from anywhere in the body. It can be coming from the hips, it can be coming from the hamstrings or calves or anywhere else. And this is why it can misguide us, mislead us when we're trying to affect it. We've got to take into account this integrated system. So first point of call would be release the muscles in the pelvis to take tension off the sciatic nervous system, mobilize the nervous system, get the spine moving nicely, and then we want to start looking at what's happening down at the ankle. And we might add in calf stretches at that point. But if you're doing calf stretches and they're not working, then the tight calf is not the issue. There's something else going on higher up the chain. Definitely have a look at those nerve mobilizations. Now, what else can we do? So let's say we find out we're a pronator or a supinator. Is there anything else we can do to improve our foot function in terms of when we squat down? Absolutely, there is loads we can do. I'm going to show you a few tips and tricks for both pronators, supinators, and neutral, anybody, for squatting when it comes to exercises. So there are some specific to one group and some specific to another, and then some that are great for all of us to improve our squat. So if you're like me and you are a pronator, then what that means is that you probably struggle with supination, which is where the foot needs to stiffen up so that when we push out of our squat, we've got a solid foot to push from. So what you can do is you can tie a band. I don't know if you can see that. You can tie a resistance band. You've got these at gyms. They're very cheap. You can get these in all sorts of shops these days. And then you wrap it around the inside of the foot so that it's to the outside of you. And then from here, literally just take the foot into supination, which is plantar flexion, adduction, and inversion. Or you're just pulling the foot in. That's the supination part. So what's happening here as I do this technique, my supinator muscles are starting to go. They're starting to feel that. And your reps and sets, again, you can start with a few sets, 2 or 3 sets of 8 to 10, work your way up to 3 sets of 15. This might feel quite intense. For some of you, you can have the leg out straight. You can have the whole leg supported, whatever is best for you. And actually, when you've done a few of these, if you're a pronator, your supinators will know about it. If you're a supinator and you struggle with pronation, then what we do is we literally flip the foot the other way around. So exactly the same technique, same exercise, but now the band is around the outside of my opposite foot, just to show the opposite way around. And then from here, we take the foot out, so abduction, eversion, and we want to really try and encourage that pronation. Dorsiflexion in there as well. And again, what's happening here is we're working these pronator muscles, and if you are a supinator, after a few reps and sets of these, you'll know about it. That one I find easier because I'm a pronator. And remember, the pronator one is just the opposite way around. I'm pulling the foot in. Supination exercise, pronation exercise, you pull the foot out. So if you have a pronator foot, you want to do supination exercises because that's what you struggle with. If you're a supinator, you want to do pronation exercises. Go and have a watch back on the video if you want to double check what those movements are. Pronation is dorsiflexion, abduction, and eversion, where the bottom of the foot turns out. Supination is plantar flexion, inversion, and adduction. It's quite complicated when you put them all together. If you understand those two movements and understand that we all need both, it makes more sense. If you're neither, if you're neutral, I've got some more stuff for you as well coming up. So proprioception work is probably good for all of us, pronators, supinators, and neutral feet. And this can be really super simple, just balance work. So we can start nice and easy. And you don't necessarily need these balance boards or Bosus. You literally can stand on one leg. See how long you can do that for? Same thing, and maybe close your eyes. Not sure how long I'll do that for. Or you could start to move your vision. Imagine passing a ball over to the other hand, oops, and then maybe going back again. And so you're challenging all the systems that influence your balance. Any kind of balance work, whether it's single leg deadlifts, good mornings, cranes, anything where you're challenging the single leg is going to help the proprioception, the foot grip, where your feet are in space. Without any load, that's perfectly safe to do with no shoes on. Even if you're like me, you're a pronator, it can start to challenge the feet. As you add load, be cautious about whether you wear your shoes or not. So when it comes to specific weightlifting shoes, so you may have seen the kind of weightlifting shoes with the wedge heel or the stiff wooden heel, and I do own a pair myself. I use the Innovates. I'm not advocating those but over any other, but what they do is they actually lift the heel. What that does is effectively allows for tight calves because it shortens the calf, or it allows you to squat down with a shortened calf. So if you struggle with that, you can get a little bit lower, and effectively it's giving you a longer tibia angle. However, I struggled to find evidence in terms of the effects of wearing a weightlifting shoe. However, I did find a study by Fortenbaugh et al. And they concluded that in the study they did, they combined the amount of anterior forward bar movement and posterior backwards hip movement that was significantly less when wearing weightlifting shoes, as opposed to wearing a standard running shoe. The study did not exhibit any other kinematic differences when using weightlifting shoes versus running shoes. So it suggests that weightlifting shoes allow for a more vertical trunk position when you're squatting, which is what's recommended for low back health and reducing loads on the knees. The question would be is there anything you can do to also reduce risk in terms of your biomechanical performance from the inside? So if you do have tight calves, then we should probably work on those, everything we've spoken about up to now. But up until that point, are you able to wear lifting shoes? Would you then remove the shoes? Probably not. I'm a pronator, I can't change that. My feet are very loose. So it's down to the individual. So another thing to really talk about here is when it comes to shoes, we shouldn't all be wearing the same shoe types. So obviously, if somebody is selling you their brand, they're selling you the shoe, and if they're saying that everybody should be in that particular shoe, then that is, they're selling, basically. We should not all be barefoot. We should not all be in a certain rigid shoe. We shouldn't all be in MBTs or Skechers or Nike or whatever it is. We should all be in the shoe that's right for our biomechanics, our foot type, and the activity we are doing. I'm really not going to move well or do my exercises well in a very barefoot or no shoes or a minimal shoe. My feet are too loose, my subtalar joint, my metatarsal joint are too loose. So if you're like me, you're a pronator, then there's probably a chance that most of the time, certainly when you're lifting or exercising, to reduce risk, we should probably wear some kind of supporting shoe. Also a supinator foot, that stiffer foot, something that gives you a bit more movement or grip, exercises to complement that. Again, it might be a different foot shoe type. So what we've got to be mindful of is being sold shoes or choosing shoes that look nice. And I get all that. I've got a cupboard full of shoes, some of which I definitely should not be wearing. So when it comes to our squat, we need to be deciding whether are we wearing the right type of shoe for the squat we're doing to reduce risk, perform well, and feel confident in our movement. However, if you have a neutral foot, you have a good grip, you have strong supination, you have good pronation, shock absorption, then there is an argument to say that for you guys, you can actually wear those minimal shoes, get away with it, feel great, and have great foot function as they help with that proprioception. So just to add in here, any Kelly Sterrett fans, he's written a great book called Supple Leopard, and he advocates forward foot position, where you put the toes forwards, and he talks a lot about the torques, which is like the corkscrew system through the tissues in the body, which I totally understand, so definitely read his book. But I physically cannot get into that position without the risk of hurting my knees. He kind of advocates testing a 10-minute squat, which, again, I agree with the concept of if we don't do something on a regular basis, we lose the ability. But just to understand, when you're in your squat, maybe have a look at where the feet land naturally in this caveman squat. See what happens to the leg above, and you can actually maybe see, let me just turn side on a little bit. There you go. You see how I've got a lot of movement, which is where I've got this loose joint. So I need some real good pelvic control to minimize that sort of rolling over. And if I have no shoes on, I'm all right with my no load in my caveman squat. But if I have no shoes on, and I was to have a load on my back, then I would be struggling. My knees would be caving in, my feet would be dropping in. So anybody who says all our feet should be 30 degrees in Ripto's context, pointing straight forwards in Sterrett's context, just be mindful of understanding the context with which they have given it. I'm sure they're not saying that we should all do that, absolutely without question. They're talking about a specific context. So we need to understand things like that when we do read authors' work. So I've got a few questions here just to run through. So Leah Klein asked, would like to be able to get to squat overhead with an ollie bar, an Olympic bar, I think she means, with no weight first, get halfway and freeze, but I don't with dumbbells. So there's a few questions I've got here that change the load or change the setting and ask why is it different. If you change the exercise, change the load, change the tool or the equipment, it is going to feel different. For Leah, I think trying to get lower with the arms overhead is not going to happen overnight, my friend. It took me a couple of years, and I did start with just a pole overhead, and you've got to work through the system. So get the pelvis moving nicely, get the spine able to extend. Remember, we looked in shoulders to allow that pec minor, the chest muscle to release, and the nerves, allowing you to get into a position where you can take the bar overhead. Everybody talks about flexibility or more range, needing more range. The last thing that some people need is more range. So if you're slightly hypermobile, if you're more bendy, more flexible, then it might be that you need more stability and to actually rein it in a little bit. So you might find, Leah, that as you work through the system, I certainly went to the point where I was hyperextending. So just be mindful that you really want that bar to stay over your midfoot as you work your way down in your squat. Time, patience, work through pelvis, spine, shoulder, knees, feet, as we've gone through on this program, and let me know how you get on. Kieran Freeborough asked me on my opinion on Steinberg squats, and I have to be honest, I had to Google it and look it up, and it's a crazy squat where you use the bar and you side lean, and I can see that it's quite an advanced technique, and the loads would be hugely impactful. So my reply to Kieran was, I've never done it, so I don't know. It looks high risk for me. I know that some athletes might benefit from it in some arenas, contexts. It's not one I'm going to be practicing in the near future with my biomechanics, Kieran, but definitely post a video if you'd like. Now, I've got a couple of interesting ones. Steve asked he would like to improve his squat movement to allow more weight. Currently, it feels like he moves more forward than he should. So again, we can look back, Steve, at all of the previous techniques we've done over the project to make sure you've got your spine and pelvis mobility and function first. He says he uses kettlebells to squat either as a goblet squat or have bells on the rack position and squat. It always seems that he's fighting to stay back on his heels, so he's being pulled forwards. Strangely, when squatting holding a TRX rope purely for stability, he has a good range of movement and can sit back more easily. Are there any drills I can suggest, or is it a case of keep practicing? So this is where the comparisons are quite different. So where Steve's using the goblet, the kettlebell, so a goblet squat is where you squat down with the kettlebell in front of you. And then the bar squat, obviously back or front, he hasn't mentioned that, so I'm not sure. But you've got a load pressing down. When it comes to the TRX, you haven't got a load. You've got a balance, something to balance you or hold on to. The load will change everything. The load is pulling you forwards. If you haven't got the mobility, then the load will pull you forwards as you go down, even with a bar on your back. And so the loads are what are making it challenging for you, Steve. So improve your basic caveman squat first without the load, work on the mobility of the spine, get all the subsystems moving better first, and then gradually practice adding load. Again, periodize your squatting in terms of weights, reps, sets, etc. Definitely use the TRX squat. I love the TRX squats. I think they're really helpful for the body to feel what a deep squat feels like, but it is clearly without load. The challenge with the TRX is to hold on as little as possible. So my friend Ryan Cross, who I've been speaking to a lot on social media, he said people whose heels elevate during the squat, would they benefit more from elevated heel squats, or is it a case of possibly tight calf muscles? Well, Ryan, that's been exactly the topic. And if you go back and read the blog, we talk about calf muscles like I have done here today on the video. You can do the dorsiflexion test. Should we use the elevations under the heels? I don't see any problem with that to begin with, but you really want to be reducing the requirement for that if possible in terms of 2 plates. I've seen a lot of people just use 2 sort of the weightlifting plates underneath the heels. What we want to do is understand why the ankle is limited in dorsiflexion, reduce that risk first, maybe using interventions like the plates temporarily, but gradually taking them away. So it might be that you do heavier squats with the weights in, and then as they go lighter, or try some lighter ones, take the heel lifts out and maybe try a few body weight or much lighter weights without, and you just kind of like move backwards and forwards as they start to work on pelvis function, nerve mobility, calf range, all the stuff we've talked about. Got an interesting question here from Nikki J. Goringe. So she's asking my view on the Andersson Squat, which is like a reverse squat where you start at the bottom. So you set the weight low, maybe in a Smith machine, you sit down, you take the bar position, and then you come out of the reverse. She's saying she can't for the life of her get out of the to squat to 90 degrees, let alone get down any further. No idea why. She can sit and stand perfectly fine. She's wondering whether it's pure strength or stability. So she can get low in the squat if she's stabilising herself, holding on, or raising her heels slightly. Wondering if practicing the reverse squat would help. I think any variation on the squat is a good thing. I think we should practice different ways of squatting to challenge different segments of it, but always thinking about the goal, our limitations, our biomechanics. If you're struggling to get down, it sounds similar, Nikki, to what we were talking about with Steve, whereby if you're holding on, you feel more stable. What you've done is you've added some neuromuscular support and a base of support or somewhere to hold on to. The minute you take your hands away, you're only on maybe your feet, which is the two bases of support, which makes it quite different. So I would definitely do exactly as we've just said with Steve, is practice between the two, get the three systems moving well, practice body weight holding on, then gradually hold on less, and you can almost kind of work the hands down, take one hand away, take the other hand away, gradually at different levels. Can the Andersson Squat help? I'm sure it can. I'm not sure it's just the answer, but I'm sure it can contribute to that kind of like reverse squat, which is the ascent. But I think there are other things that might need to come into play first. I've got a question here from Jilly. Does it matter if checking squatability barefoot? It might do, Jilly, in terms of whether they are a pronator or a supinator. I guess if you're checking their squat, it depends on what you're looking for. So if you ask somebody to squat with shoes on and with shoes off, that might tell you the safest or the best way to ask them to do their squats if you're coaching them or training them. Or if you're looking at your own squat, as I suggested earlier, no weights at all, just body weight. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that barefoot. It's good to get the feet to feel the floor proprioceptively, but the minute you add weight, you're raising the risk. So if you've got any issues at the feet, like me, you're unstable or loose around those joints, adding load to barefoot might be risky. And then movement bunny. I can Hindi squat, which is caveman squat, our version. With the feet flat, no problem, but as soon as I add weight, I find it difficult to come down. And she says she has an anterior pelvis tilt, which is a whole other debate. We can talk about that another time. So why would it feel so difficult to come down with a bar on the back? Again, this is about balancing loads on the three subsystems, which you may have areas that need some work in terms of being able to support a load on the back. So the Hindi squat, there's no load other than your body weight coming down. There's less risk, proprioceptively, you haven't got to balance something. The minute you add load, it's quite a different experience, obviously, which is what you're explaining here. So if you go back, the last couple of questions will probably help you with that. Work on the three subsystems, gradually start to improve. Start with a light weight, start with holding on, start taking the hands away, and gradually, over time, what we should see as an improvement. The minute you add a load, it will change things. The force, the compressive load on the back, if you have any amount of instability, a dysfunction, anything where you're not able to hold the bar over the midfoot through the whole of your squat, the weight is going to destabilize you. So if you're aiming to understand where the bar should be, you can squat down side onto a mirror or a camera, watch a video yourself, and the load should always be in line with your midfoot. Otherwise, if the bar goes forwards, that's going to pull you forwards and excessively load your extensors. If it's back, which is not as common, then obviously it's going to topple you over backwards. More commonly, what happens if we get pulled forwards, that's because we can't extend the spine, or there are other things going on, the tight calves, etc., all the things we've spoken about. And finally, my friend Stevie Barr, I think we've probably answered your question through the last few questions. Again, it's about being able to stabilize the squat with load, without load. Why is it so different? So that's squat part 6 in terms of the feet. I mean, there is loads more on this subject. I could talk forever, as you've probably realized. I'm trying to make these short video clips so they're easy for you to watch. But what I'd like to know is how it's going for you. Do you have any more questions? I'm going to do a final video next week just to bring everything back together and do a run through. Make sure you read the blog. Otherwise, see you next time.